Hello, my name is Yaseen Ali, and the title of my presentation is Translanguaging and Metacognitive Learning Strategies, Moving Beyond English Only. For this presentation, I've decided to focus on a subset of my study rather than attempt to encapsulate all the findings from my dissertation, and as such, I present qualitative data on a select few student participants' metacognitive and translingual learning strategies, given my work as a learning strategist working in student services. I will share more context about my student-facing position shortly. I want to begin with the key problem of epistemic injustice that my study aimed to redress, at least in the sphere of influence as a learning strategist who works predominantly with students, but who also collaborates with course instructors and teaching assistants from time to time. This is an issue that manifests in English medium instruction and Anglophone higher education institutions, but for the sake of conciseness, I use English medium instruction, EMI, to stand in for both contexts in this presentation. This argument regarding epistemic injustice is based on the work of Otagai, Garcia and Reed, and Zhang and Chiu, respectively. They argue that monolingual users are positioned to leverage their full idiolects in their academic learning, namely their personal individual language systems. To quote Li Wei, "The language we individually produce is an idiolect, our own unique personal language. No two idiolects are likely to be the same, and no single individual's idiolect is likely to be the same over time." However, if we compare this profile to the idiolect of a multilingual user who uses English as an additional language, EAL, clearly it is not an equal playing field. In other words, these students are pressured or even forced to choose a fraction of their idiolect to engage in and co-construct knowledge. As such, translanguaging, or Englishing, as I will discuss shortly in my study, is a potential remedy to mitigate this injustice because it is a trans-epistemic strategy, according to the authors mentioned previously. First, translanguaging allows students to access the full range of their idiolects, whether through translation, code meshing, or translingual learning strategies, as I will provide evidence for in my findings in this presentation. Second, translanguaging fosters learning cultures where students can draw upon all of their resources, linguistic or otherwise, to exercise agency and decision-making in their academic learning in the context of EMI. I want to provide brief insights into my role as a learning strategist, as this project was an action research study about my own critical language awareness curriculum and my student-facing advising. These are just a few of the ways to describe the work of learning strategists, also called learning specialists at some institutions, but of course there are many more facets and approaches. Generally speaking, strategists support students' questions around learning development and academic performance, everything from study techniques to time and energy management to reducing procrastination. I'm chiefly interested in supporting student metacognition and self-awareness in degree learning, as well as student strategies on deciphering multimedia texts. For instance, students can now read articles by listening to text-to-speech output, write their essays through talking out loud into transcription platforms, and even draw their assignment outlines as concept maps. Learning strategists must keep up with accelerating technologies, which in turn redefine traditional notions of texts and literacies. However, since the COVID-19 pandemic, international and EAL identifying students were sharing really challenging experiences in their classroom and lab activities. These are not meant as exhaustive or all-encompassing. Of course, international students are not a monolithic community. They are not all EAL users, and vice versa. Not all EAL users are study permit holders in Canada. That said, the students that I was working with were sharing concerning anecdotes about engaging in negative self-talk, being corrected without permission, and opting out of classroom discussions altogether. These experiences are representative of what Fricker and Catala term epistemic injustice, both hermeneutical and testimonial. As such, I developed a critical language awareness curriculum that sought to shift our collective attentions away from English proficiency, fidelity based on a named language, and towards Englishing, a situated and dynamic practice consisting not only of translingual elements across languages, but semiotic and environmental resources as well. To the left of this slide, I have situated English and its limitations as a self-contained linguistic system. Even if we pluralize English or locate its usage within geographical parameters as defined by nation-states, this still reifies English as a measurable thing, according to Alistair Pennycook. Moreover, Suhanti Motha argues that world in front of Englishes ultimately stands in for non-Western. Finally, Adrian Holiday argues that regardless of noble intentions in pluralizing varieties of Englishes, English language teaching still upholds the norms of BANA countries, that is, British, Australasian, and North American contexts, as the true and legitimate forms of English. Englishing, rather, as defined by Pennycook, or lingua franca English, as termed by Suresh Kanagaraja, draw our attention to what users actually do with language. Rather than lexicogrammatical sharedness, it is the negotiation strategies, technologies, and translingual practices that underscore meaning-making. To quote Suresh Kanagaraja, lingua franca English speakers are not moving towards someone else's target, they are constructing their own norms. And so I designed what I call the Englishing Workshop, which aimed to address these issues in community and challenge English-only expectations through a translanguaging paradigm. Translanguaging literature is rich and called many different things, for example, code switching, code meshing, interlanguage, language mixing, and there's even disagreement about whether those are the same thing within the literature, but essentially it's about recognizing users' movements across traditionally named languages. My usage considers practices not only going beyond using named languages, but the affordances of users' semiotic and material resources in languaging as well. Some of the ways that I operationalized translanguaging and talked about it with students, the first is regarding it as a practical theory of language, i.e. what students actually do. So this returns agency to its users. Translanguaging can also be regarded as a classroom pedagogy where students' languages outside of English or formal instruction are brought in as resources in meaning making, in communication. And finally, what I focus on in this presentation is translanguaging as a trans-epistemic learning strategy to foster epistemic justice. Here's a snapshot of the Englishing curriculum that the participants in my study completed. I won't discuss all of them in detail, but feel free to pause the video if you're interested in all the stages. The students began their experience with this Englishing workshop, which discussed the differences between English and Englishing, the English language's history as a translingual language, and how accents are both neutral phonological data and a relational construct produced mutually by speakers and receivers. After that, participants had the chance to debrief their learning with the peer facilitator, where I, as the researcher, was absent. Throughout the semester, they completed self-directed modules on the translanguaging and negotiation strategies they were using in classrooms and labs. And finally, participants and I met at the end of the term to co-interpret any shifts in their beliefs and practices as a result of participating in the study. Frame analysis is based on the work of Irving Goffman, and it was further adapted by Rob Lowe in the context of critical language education. A language frame is an empirically observable belief or attitude towards language that, upon closer inspection and applying critical language awareness, reveals ideologies and discourses at work. For example, a common language frame expressed in the study by participants was that EAL users need to adopt standardized English or sound/write like a native speaker because it would result in better educational and professional opportunities in the host society. This could be connected to what Christopher Jenks and Jerry Wan Lee term native speaker saviorism. That is the ideology that EAL users are better positioned for upward mobility and are more seamlessly accepted into the host society if they adhere to so-called native user standards, nebulous and unstable as those benchmarks may be. My goal with frame analysis was to generate and make manifest the entanglements, contradictions, and even hypocrisies in students' metalanguaging, not as untenable dissonances, but spaces to investigate their beliefs further. Where did these attitudes come from? Are there other possibilities? Could those language frames shift as a result of engaging in this curriculum about pluralizing notions of languages and languaging? All this said, my aim in this study was not to criticize students for espousing or even perpetuating these beliefs, that is, that these language frames are evidence of shortcomings. Rather, I want to situate how we are all mired in language ideologies and continually grapple with them while we internalize, challenge, or even leverage them for our aims. Here are the research questions that I developed in my study. First, what are EAL identifying graduate students' language frames, i.e. beliefs, attitudes, self-reported practices, about the named language English? What is the impact of an Englishing curriculum on these students' language frames about diverse Englishing practices, users of those Englishing practices, and even their self-perceptions while Englishing or translanguaging? And over the course of a semester while engaging in reflexive meta-languaging activities, do the students and I collectively, collaboratively interpret any shifts away from their initial language frames? Here are a few brief demographic data points about the participants in the study. 22 EAL identifying graduate students participated. Of that number, 18 identified as study permit holders. We had very heavy representation from education and engineering. 18 students were pursuing master's degrees and 4 were pursuing doctorate studies. These are the 3 examples of translingual learning strategies that students discussed in their reflections. First, self-testing and elaboration using languages other than academic English. Second, using their additional languages or other codes to boost efficiency in note-taking. And finally, going beyond English only to generate variety and language learning outside of academics. In these examples below, the participants Mridul and Ildiz echoed one another in terms of using their first languages, Bangla and Turkish respectively, to test their knowledge while catching up with their parents over the phone. Mridul, who is a user of Bangla, Urdu, Hindi, and English, states, "I have also talked to my elderly parents in my native language about the research work. They understood some ideas and did not understand some idea. However, while explaining, I realized that I myself had many misunderstanding and lack of knowledge in the research work. This has helped me to realign my own study first to the research question. I guess when I did not have the pressure to speak in English, I realized the heart of the work quickly." Ildiz states something very similar. "Because explaining something is the best way to learn, I think so. But I can't really know when I'm explaining things in English that if I can't explain it because my English is limited or my understanding is limited. But when I do it in my native language, I know the language is not the problem, at least." And in both these examples, we can appreciate how these students are introducing, welcoming their first language as a resource, as an asset in terms of pursuing their goals of academic English. Mridul talks about lowering that affective filter, speaking in that language that he feels really comfortable with a trusted audience to get the point across, encountering some gaps, and realizing that that's what he needs to study more effectively, give more priority towards. Ildiz, in the same way, realizes that when she cannot explain something in Turkish, that is something to really zoom in on and prioritize in deeper study. Here are 2 participants' reflections about translingual note-taking. Penelope, who completed a previous degree in Germany, shared that she frequently heard the word Bildung in German, which refers to one's holistic learning development and personal growth throughout composite life experiences, not just formal schooling alone. As such, when she conducted her own research study as a PhD student in English, she noted down her participants' references to this rounded concept using the German word. She described this action as very subconscious and underlined that her translingual note-taking is directly related to 2 considerations: emotionality and efficiency. She also stressed the importance of saving time, pointing to how her personal abbreviations are more effectively retrieved and deployed in her note-taking, especially for capturing longer multisyllabic words in English and German. Boba, a graduate student who uses Mandarin, English, and some Cantonese, shared that mind mapping allowed her to brainstorm effectively and establish a clear plan for her ideas. She reflected that she would previously push herself to employ just one language in her past planning, but how at times this would lead to confusion when she referred back to the documents. She considered how dual coding, mixing lexical elements, visual elements in both Chinese and English, might be, quote, easier to understand and high efficiency. In the final interview, Boba confirmed that while she largely applied English during mind mapping, sometimes she, quote, would go for Chinese as much. Boba underscored that integrating Chinese in these situations afforded her 2 advantages: ease and emphasis. That is, writing a word or phrase in Chinese simply felt quicker or helped her succinctly flag that something was especially important to her future self. As a learning strategist, I often find that motivation comes into my appointments and conversations with students in some way. Therefore, I really valued Luna's contributions here, talking about novelty and variation with the languages she uses according to the context, the outcome, and her own personal learning goals. For instance, she discussed using English for academic settings such as classroom discussions, writing papers as a graduate student. She also mentioned that Chinese was associated with her biographical identity and that felt appropriate for some conversations and relationships. But I found these latter 2 points very interesting. She talked about noting down mundane, everyday tasks in Japanese, such as going grocery shopping. That felt a little bit more interesting and provided some contrast given all the mundane and quotidian aspects of her life. She also mentioned using Portuguese for journaling, where she talked about very specific emotions. For example, saudade in Portuguese is more evocative than sadness in English. And here I quote Luna directly. I do not want to put going grocery shopping down in my mother language, as it might make the already tedious chore even more so. Using English, however, would make it quite academic or formal, since English is the language mostly used in my academic setting. Japanese, on the other hand, is the language I chose to learn for fun because I love Japanese culture and values. Therefore, the Japanese language often associates entertainment and joyful things for me. Therefore, if I put down going grocery shopping in Japanese, my brain automatically associates the grocery shopping experience with excitement and as something I look forward to doing. I did want to share at the close of this presentation some of the limitations of my study, such as the sample size, student demographics, and institutional nuances. These were 22 graduate students, heavy representation from education and engineering. It was done in a co-curricular space given my role as a learning strategist, so I wonder what would have happened in a curricular space working directly with an instructor as a partner. I also wanted to mention that translanguaging, Englishing, this language mixing cannot be seen in a vacuum. Sender Dovchin offers that translingual discrimination intersects with other forms of precarity such as job security, housing, food security, and also this really important piece around student reticence, agency, and desire. That said, I propose that Englishing can support a holistic orientation to languaging that supports EAL students' bespoke translingual learning strategies, meaning they're very idiosyncratic and very personalized, as you have hopefully seen with the last few examples. Their access to epistemic justice because they can leverage the full range of their idiolects. And finally, this notion of fluidity and fixity, that it's not just one or the other, meaning standardized English versus translanguaging, but it's more about stance, about positionality, and again, agency. Thank you so much. Here are my works cited and consulted for this presentation. And the remainder. I'm happy to share all of these via email. If you reach out, I'll present that shortly. Once again, thank you. My email address is yaseen.ali@utoronto.ca.